My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and for 19 days in March, I was legally alive and functionally gone. A drunk driver ran a light on Route 9 and folded my sedan around a light pole, and while I lay in a hospital bed in a coma with a tube down my throat, my mother sat in a lawyer's office 4 miles away and had my name removed from her will. Not adjusted, not reduced. Removed, the way you'd delete a line from a grocery list. She was always the difficult one, she told the attorney, according to the notes I'd later read myself. Better to make it clean now, while things are settled. Things were not settled. I was on a ventilator. My mother signed the amendment on a Tuesday. I opened my eyes on a Thursday. This is the story of what happens when the difficult daughter wakes up and asks to see the paperwork. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This channel is where quiet people finally tell the stories they carried alone. Family, betrayal, and the moment everything changed. If you've ever been the one who gets blamed for noticing things, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. To explain the will, I have to start with the word difficult, because that word did more damage in my family than any accident ever could. I grew up in Danvers, a mill town outside Boston that still smells like the river on humid days. My mother, Elaine Whitfield, ran the house the way a stage manager runs a play. Cues, marks, a script everyone had memorized except me, because I kept asking why we were performing it. My father, Gerald, died when I was 11, and after that my mother needed exactly two things from her children: agreement and applause. My older brother Marcus gave her both, effortlessly, the way some people are just born double-jointed. I gave her neither. I asked why. I asked why Marcus got the car at 16 and I got a bus pass. I asked why family dinners always ended with a toast to Marcus's potential and never once to my report card, which was better. My mother had a phrase for this. She'd set down her fork, look at me the way you'd look at a stain you hadn't noticed yet, and say, "Must you always be so difficult, Dana?" I was 9 the first time she said it. I was 33 the last time, 3 days before the accident, when I asked her gently why she'd told my aunt I was still figuring myself out at a family barbecue when I had, in fact, just made partner at my firm. "Don't be difficult," she said, and refilled her wine. Difficult was the tax I paid for having opinions in a house that only wanted echoes. There was one person who never once used that word on me. My grandmother, Vivian, my father's mother, who lived alone in a converted carriage house behind a bookstore 2 towns over and answered her landline like it was 1974. Every other Sunday from the time I was 7, I told my mother I was going to the library, and I biked to Vivian's instead. Vivian never asked me to perform anything. She let me read her law books. She'd been a legal secretary for 40 years and still had opinions about contract language the way other grandmothers have opinions about casseroles. She taught me to read a document line by line instead of skimming for the parts that flattered me. Most people, she told me once, sliding me a mug of Earl Grey, sign things because they trust the person handing them the pen, not because they read the pen's terms. Don't be most people, Dana girl. I didn't know yet that sentence would save my life. There was one strange rule at Vivian's, though, same as every good rule in a family like mine. She never came to our house, and my mother never said her name at our table. If they crossed paths at my father's grave on the anniversary, the air between them turned the temperature of the granite. Once I asked Vivian why. She poured more tea instead of answering, which was Vivian's version of a locked door. "That's a story about your mother, sweetheart, not about you." Then she handed me a cookie, which is how she ended conversations she didn't want to have. I filed it away the way I filed away everything from that house. The toasts to Marcus, the bus pass, the 2 different mothers I seemed to have depending on which room I stood in. I became a corporate attorney, which my mother described at parties as "Dana does something with contracts," the same tone she'd use for a hobby. Marcus became a real estate agent who sold exactly one house every 18 months and lived, at 36, in the guest room of our mother's house, a fact everyone in the family agreed not to mention out loud. I paid for things. That was my role, the way it's the role for every difficult daughter who happens to also be competent. I paid off my mother's roof in 2019. I paid off Marcus's car loan in 2021 after he called crying, because apparently even grown men cry about repossession notices. I paid the property tax on the house twice, quietly, wiring it directly to the town so my mother wouldn't have the indignity of asking. I kept records. Not because I distrusted them, I told myself for years, but because law school trains you to keep records the way medicine trains a nurse to check a pulse. Reflex, not suspicion. It took the accident to teach me the difference. Here is what I want you to understand about the accident, because I've told this part so many times it's gone smooth, like a stone in a river, and I want to hand it to you rough, the way it actually was. I was driving home from a deposition on a Tuesday night in March when a man doing 61 in a 35 ran the light at Route 9 in Merrimack. I don't remember the impact. I remember the deposition, and then I remember a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like Ohio 3 weeks later, and a nurse named Priya asking me if I knew my own name. What happened in between, I've had to reconstruct from other people's memories. The way you reconstruct a crime scene. 19 days. A coma from a traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding they'd had to open me up twice to control. My prognosis for the first week was described to my family in the kind of hedged medical language that means the doctors are preparing you for the worst without saying it. My emergency contact was still, from a form I'd filled out years ago, my mother. Marcus flew in from wherever Marcus was that week and stayed 4 days before work, called him back, though nobody at that time could tell me what job that was. My mother came every day for the cameras of it. If you'll forgive me the cynicism I've since earned the right to, and sat in the family waiting room making calls. I know this because Priya told me later that my mother spent more time in the hallway on her phone than at my bedside, and because the hospital, God bless institutional record-keeping, logs visitor sign-ins with timestamps. My mother's longest visit in 19 days was 14 minutes. On day 11, according to those same records I'd later pull, my mother left the hospital at 2:40 in the afternoon and drove to the office of Halloran and Reyes, the family's estate attorney, a firm I'd actually recommended to her myself years ago, back when recommending things to my mother still felt like being trusted. She met with Peter Halloran for 55 minutes. What she signed that day was a codicil, a formal amendment to her will, striking my name from every clause I'd previously appeared in. The house, her retirement accounts, my father's life insurance payout she'd never touched, all of it, and redirecting the entirety to Marcus. The document itself, which I'd eventually hold in my own hands, used the phrase, "In consideration of my daughter Dana's consistently difficult and unsupportive conduct toward this family." Consistently difficult. While I was unconscious and being kept alive by a machine that breathed for me, my mother found time to type consistently and mean it. I want to be precise here, because this is the part where people usually call the woman in the story bitter, and I've earned better than that word too. My mother didn't just cut me out. She backdated her reasoning into a version of me that couldn't argue, because I wasn't breathing on my own to argue with. That's not an accident of timing. That's a woman who saw an unconscious daughter and thought, finally, a version of Dana I can write about however I like. I woke up on day 19. Not dramatically, no gasp, no soap opera sit-up. Priya told me I'd been tracking movement for 2 days before I said my first word, which was, apparently, why, which everyone in my family would have found extremely on brand if they'd been paying closer attention. My mother was not in the room when I woke up. She arrived 4 hours later, stayed 11 minutes, told me I looked tired, and left to let me rest, which is a sentence that meant something different to me after I read the timestamps. The next 6 weeks were relearning how to be a body, physical therapy for a leg that had forgotten what it was for, cognitive therapy for the gaps. I lost about 90 minutes before the crash permanently, which the doctor said was normal, and which felt, honestly, like losing a room out of a house I used to live in. Marcus visited twice during outpatient rehab, both times for under 20 minutes, both times to ask, gently, delicately, whether I remembered signing anything recently, which I now understand was Marcus doing reconnaissance for our mother, badly, the way Marcus does everything. I didn't think about the will at all during those 6 weeks. I want that on the record. I wasn't plotting. I was learning to walk in a straight line without a wall to catch me. It was Vivian, during one of my rehab visits. She came every single week, same as she'd shown up every other Sunday for 27 years, sliding into the waiting room chair with her purse on her lap like she was waiting for a bus, who finally said the thing nobody else would. "Dana girl," she said, watching me work a resistance band with my bad hand. "Did your mother ever tell you she went to see Peter Halloran while you were under?" I stopped. "How do you know that?" "Because Peter's my cousin's boy, and small towns don't keep secrets. They just keep them from the person they're about." She reached over and steadied the band in my hand without making it look like she was helping. "I'm not telling you to scare you. I'm telling you because you taught yourself to read documents at my kitchen table, and I think it's time you read one." I didn't sleep that night. What I did instead was the thing 19 years of training had built into my hands before it ever reached my heart. I requested my own hospital records, visitor logs, timestamps, physician notes, because as the patient, I was entitled to every page. Then I called Halloran and Reyes directly, identified myself as Dana Whitfield, and asked, politely, professionally, the way I'd ask any firm for discovery, for a copy of any estate document my mother had executed involving my name, since I was a named party with a legitimate interest in reviewing changes made concerning me. Peter Halloran, to his credit, sounded uncomfortable on the phone in a way that told me everything before the documents arrived. Attorneys don't sound uncomfortable delivering good news. The codicil came by mail 4 days later. I read it standing at my own kitchen counter with a mug of Vivian's Earl Grey going cold beside me, because some habits are just correct, and some habits you keep because the woman who taught them to you is still alive to be proud of you for using them. Here's the number I want you to hold on to, the way I've held on to it since. Between 2019 and the week of the accident, I had personally paid, in documented transfers I could trace to the dollar, $162,000 toward my mother's roof, my mother's property taxes, Marcus's car, Marcus's 2 bridge loans that never once found their way back across the bridge, and one Thanksgiving that had to look right because the Hendersons from church were coming. $162,000 paid by the difficult daughter while I was conscious and useful. And on day 11 of my coma, when I stopped being useful and started being, medically, a liability that might not resolve favorably, my mother's estimate of my worth to this family went to zero inside 55 minutes in a lawyer's conference room. I didn't cry reading it. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears, and I'd like to describe what actually happened, which was colder and, I think, more useful. Something in my chest that had been open for 34 years quietly, finally, closed. Not slammed. Closed the way a door closes when the person on the other side has told you, plainly, they were never planning to walk through it. I finished the tea. I called Vivian. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, like she'd been sitting by the phone since I was 7. "I read it," I said. "I know you did," Vivian said. "You've had that voice since you were 9. Tell me the number first. You always start with the number. It's how I know you're going to be all right." I gave her the number. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the sentence I've carried in my chest ever since, the same way I once carried her tea across the kitchen without spilling it. Careful, because it mattered. "Your mother didn't remove you from a will, Dana. She removed you from a story she'd already finished writing before you woke up. The only mistake she made was writing it down where a lawyer could read it back to you." I told her I needed a few days. She told me to take a month if I needed it, and to come to the carriage house on Sunday regardless, because I always had, and some tables don't stop being set just because a person is thinking. What I want to walk you through next is the part where I stopped being a patient and started being a lawyer again. Because that transition, the exact hour it happened, is, I think, the real center of this story. 3 weeks after I read the codicil, still on partial disability leave, still walking with a cane on bad days, I drove to Halloran and Reyes myself. Not to contest anything. I want to be clear about that, because I know what the internet does with a story like this, and I need you to understand this was never about the house or the money, not really, not by the time I was sitting in that lobby. I went to request one specific document, the physician's capacity assessment, if one existed, from the day my mother signed. Peter Halloran, a decent man doing an indecent family's paperwork, told me, carefully, that Massachusetts does not require a capacity assessment of the person signing an amendment when they are, themselves, of sound mind and simply amending their own will regarding another party. My mother had been entirely, legally, competently within her rights. That's the part that took me longest to sit with. She hadn't broken any law. She'd simply shown me, with perfect legal cleanliness, exactly what she thought of me the moment I stopped being able to argue back. I want to pause here and talk to you directly for a second, because I know some of you have lived a version of this. If you've ever found out what your family really believes about you in the one window when they thought you couldn't hear it, you already know there's no lawsuit for that. There's no codicil for the truth. Tell me in the comments if you've ever read something you weren't supposed to see and understood your whole childhood in a single paragraph. If you're new here, subscribe, because what happened at my mother's 60th birthday dinner 4 months later, in front of everyone she'd ever performed for, is the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. Recovery kept moving whether my family paid attention to it or not. I went back to work part-time in June, full-time by August. My firm, to their genuine credit, had kept my office exactly as I'd left it, deposition binder still open on the desk to the page I'd never finished reading before the accident. I finished it. There's a kind of satisfaction in finishing a sentence a drunk driver interrupted that I don't think I can fully explain to someone who hasn't needed it. I also, quietly, in July, changed my own documents. My healthcare proxy, which had been my mother since I was 22, I changed to Vivian. My emergency contact on every form I could find, I changed to Vivian. And my own will, because attorneys, more than anyone, understand that you don't get to complain about a document you haven't bothered to write yourself. I rewrote from scratch. I left specific, itemized bequests to two people, my paralegal, Renata, who'd driven 90 minutes each way to the hospital every single day of my coma on her own time, and never once told me until Vivian mentioned it in passing, and Vivian herself, including my father's watch, which my mother had told me for years was already accounted for. A lie I only discovered was a lie when I asked the estate attorney directly, and he confirmed no such provision existed anywhere in any document my mother had ever filed. I didn't tell my mother any of this. There was no confrontation planned. I want to be honest that for a while, I thought there wouldn't be one at all. That the whole thing would simply end in silence, the quietest kind of ending, which is sometimes the only kind available. Then my mother decided, without consulting me, that her 60th birthday would be held at the Colonial Inn, 40 guests, and that I would, of course, be giving a toast. Since you're back on your feet now and everyone's been asking after you. Everyone's been asking after you, as if I'd been on a cruise. I said yes. I want you to sit with that the way I sat with it, because I've thought about it 100 times since, and I still believe it was the right decision. I said yes because Vivian, wise as ever, told me over tea that some doors don't need to be slammed. Some doors just need to be opened, fully, in good lighting, so everyone in the room can see exactly what's been standing behind them the whole time. The dinner was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who runs her life like a stage production. String lights, a photo slideshow set to music, Marcus giving a toast about our mother's unshakable strength that ran 4 minutes longer than anyone needed. My mother sat at the head of the table in a blue dress she'd bought for the occasion, glowing in the specific way people glow when they believe the whole room has gathered to confirm a story about them. She'd invited the Hendersons. She'd invited two of her sisters. She had not invited Vivian, which nobody but me seemed to find strange, since Vivian had been my father's mother for 68 years and had somehow never once been welcome at a Whitfield table since his funeral. I'd invited Vivian myself, quietly, and seated her beside me. When it was my turn to toast, I stood up with a printed card in my hand, which surprised no one, because attorneys bring printed cards to everything. I thanked my mother for the party, I thanked the room for coming. And then, because I had spent 4 months deciding exactly how much truth a birthday dinner could hold, I said this, and I remember every word because I'd rewritten it the way I rewrite a closing argument, until every syllable was load-bearing. This year taught me something about family I didn't expect to learn at 34. I spent 19 days unconscious after my accident, and I've since learned that during that time, decisions were made about who I am and what I'm owed by the people who claim to love me most. Decisions made while I couldn't speak for myself. I don't say that to embarrass anyone tonight. I say it because I think it's the most honest toast I can give my mother. Happy birthday, Mom. I hope the next 60 years are built on decisions you'd still be proud of if the person they were about happened to wake up and read them. The room did the thing rooms do when they sense something has shifted but can't name it. A small, uncertain laugh from someone who thought it might be a joke. A clink of glasses that started and then thinned out. My mother's face did something I'd been waiting 34 years to see. It lost the script. For 3 full seconds, Elaine Whitfield, who had never once in my presence been without a line ready, had absolutely nothing to say. Then she recovered, laughed too brightly, said something about Dana's dry sense of humor, and the room, trained by decades of her direction, laughed along and moved on to cake. But Vivian saw it, and Peter Halloran's wife, Marjorie, who happened to be one of my mother's two invited sisters' closest friends, saw it too, and, small towns keeping their secrets from exactly the wrong person, same as always, mentioned it within the week to exactly enough people that my mother found herself fielding questions at the hair salon she hadn't planned for. I didn't post anything. I didn't correct anyone. I've learned this year, if nothing else, that silence isn't a weapon. It's just what a woman sounds like when she's finally done explaining herself to people who only listened when it cost them nothing. My mother called me 9 days after the party. Not to apologize. I want to be clear, because tidy endings are for people who weren't there, and I wasn't going to get one. She called to ask, carefully, delicately, whether I still had a copy of the original will, the one before the codicil, in case we wanted to revisit things as a family. I sat with my phone against my ear in my own kitchen, the same counter where I'd first read the document that changed everything, and I told her the truth as plainly as I could manage. Mom, I'm not difficult. I was just the only one in this family who read things all the way to the end. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said my name, once, in a voice I didn't recognize, and I let the silence sit there until she hung up first. Months have passed since then, and I'll keep this honest, because tidy endings are for people who weren't there. My mother has not restored my name to her will, as far as I know, and I haven't asked, because I no longer need a document to tell me what I'm worth. Marcus still lives in her guest room. The house still needs a roof it can no longer afford, since I stopped quietly wiring money the week I read the codicil, and my mother, I'm told, has started mentioning at church that kids these days don't understand family obligation, which the Hendersons, apparently, have started politely changing the subject away from. Vivian's carriage house got a new front step this spring, the one I'd been meaning to fix for years, finally fixed, paid for, and installed by me on a Saturday, because some tables are worth investing in and some are not, and learning the difference cost me a coma and a codicil, and was worth more than anything my mother's estate was ever going to leave me. I have dinner there every other Sunday, same as always, except now it isn't a secret from anyone, because I stopped keeping secrets the day I stopped needing my mother's approval to justify where I spent my time. Renata made partner track this year, on my recommendation, and doesn't know yet that she's named in my will, and I'd like to keep it that way for now, because some things should stay unearned gestures instead of transactions, which is a distinction my mother never once managed to learn. I still practice law, still keep records the way Vivian taught me, obsessively, line by line, because you never know which document in your life is going to be the one somebody reads back to you when you're not in the room to explain yourself. Last month, a junior associate at my firm asked me how I stayed so calm reviewing a hostile contract during a negotiation that had gone sideways in front of a client. And I told her the truest thing I know now that I didn't know at 9 or 18 or 33. You get very clear, I told her, about which people in your life were only ever generous to you as a transaction, and once you see the ledger, you stop being surprised by the balance. She wrote it down. I hope it costs her less than it cost me. That's my story. One will, quietly rewritten while I couldn't object, and one toast that made sure everyone in the room heard it read back exactly once. If you've ever woken up, from a coma, or just from a lifetime of believing you were the difficult one, and found out what your family really thought while they assumed you couldn't hear them, take this as your sign to read your own documents, all the way to the end. Share this video with someone who reads the fine print. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.